The Invisible Man. A janitor pushed his mop cart through the cell block, invisible to everyone around him. The inmates saw only the gray uniform, the lowered eyes, the methodical movements of someone society had relegated to its margins. But what they couldn't see was about to change everything, for one young man facing life behind bars, and for an entire institution that had forgotten what redemption looked like. Get ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about strength, wisdom, and the power of one person who refused to give up on humanity. Marcus Webb had cleaned these floors for 3 years, each stroke of his mop a meditation, each bucket of water a baptism of patience. The inmates called him Old Man, though he was barely 52. They didn't know his story, how he'd once been a law professor at Georgetown, how a single devastating mistake had collapsed his entire world, landing him here with a 7-year sentence for embezzlement that had spiraled from desperation, not greed. He'd learned quickly that survival in federal prison required a particular kind of invisibility. Not the cowering invisibility of weakness, but the deliberate invisibility of someone who understood that true power resided in observation, not confrontation. While others postured and threatened, Marcus watched. While they shouted their importance, he listened to the silence between their words. The other inmates despised him at first. His refusal to engage in the constant performance of masculinity read as weakness. His quietness seemed like judgment. His education, which inevitably leaked out, became another barrier. "Think you're better than us," they'd mutter, spitting near his cart. Marcus never responded. He simply continued his work with the same methodical precision, understanding that transformation required roots that grew slowly, invisibly, beneath the surface. Then came the day he noticed the young man in cell block D, 22 years old, facing a mandatory life sentence for his third strike, a drug charge that resulted from being in the wrong car with the wrong people. Dante Morrison sat on his bunk with the particular stillness that Marcus recognized, not the calm of acceptance, but the frozen paralysis of someone watching their entire future collapse into a single, endless moment. The boy's public defender had already told him the truth. With his prior convictions, even though both were non-violent, the federal sentencing guidelines left no room for mercy. The judge's hands would be tied. Life meant life. Marcus saw something in Dante's eyes that others missed. Not defiance or resignation, but a flickering intelligence being slowly extinguished by despair. The young man had been reading legal texts from the prison library, pages covered with desperate notes, searching for an escape that didn't exist in any statute he could understand. What happened next would reveal the true nature of power, not the power of position or violence, but the power of knowledge applied with surgical precision to the architecture of injustice itself. Marcus emptied his bucket and began, "The architecture of attention. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, overlooked and underestimated, then this chapter is for you. Sometimes our greatest strength emerges not when we demand to be seen, but when we master the art of selective visibility." Subscribe now to discover how one man's patient observation became the foundation for an impossible victory. Marcus understood that attention was currency in prison. Most inmates hoarded it like gold, demanding recognition through volume and aggression. But Marcus had learned a different economy, the power of strategic invisibility that allowed him to see patterns others missed. He'd noticed Dante 3 weeks before approaching him. The young man's daily routine revealed an organized mind fighting against chaos. Dante woke at 5:30 each morning, making his bunk with military precision despite having nowhere to go. He spent 2 hours in the library every afternoon, returning with different legal volumes, creating a self-directed education from fragments. But Marcus also noticed the mistakes. Dante was reading federal sentencing guidelines without understanding the procedural history behind them. He was researching appellate procedures without grasping the jurisdictional nuances that made certain arguments viable. His intelligence was evident but directionless, like a powerful engine without a transmission. The breakthrough came during Tuesday's floor cleaning in the library. Marcus worked slowly near Dante's usual table, his movements creating a presence without intrusion. The young man was surrounded by books, United States Code, Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, a worn paperback on constitutional law. "You're looking in the wrong place," Marcus said quietly, not lifting his eyes from the floor. Dante's head snapped up, suspicion immediate. Excuse me? Sentencing guidelines won't help you. The mandatory minimum is statutory, but the statute has exceptions you haven't found yet. Marcus squeezed his mop, the water wringing out with methodical pressure. You're fighting the sentence when you should be fighting the conviction itself. My lawyer already. Your lawyer filed a standard appeal based on sentencing disparities. I read the brief. It was competent, but irrelevant. Marcus moved to the next section of floor, his voice never rising above conversation level. The real issue is in how evidence was admitted at trial, specifically, the testimony from the confidential informant. Dante stood, legal texts forgotten. How do you know about my case? Marcus finally looked up, his eyes meeting the young man's with calm directness. I know about everyone's case. I clean the legal offices. I empty the trash where prosecutors draft their strategies and public defenders file their perfunctory motions. Information doesn't disappear. It just becomes invisible to people who aren't looking. The library was empty except for them, the afternoon count having drawn most inmates back to their cells. Marcus continued speaking, his words precise as surgery. Your case hinges on the testimony of CI-147, whose identity was protected throughout the trial. Your attorney never challenged the reliability foundation for that testimony, never questioned whether the CI actually had first-hand knowledge or was simply repeating information from another source, which would make it inadmissible hearsay. Dante's expression shifted from suspicion to desperate hope. Can we prove that? Possibly, if we can access the CI's debriefing reports and cross-reference them with the investigation timeline. Those documents exist in the prosecutor's file, but they were never turned over during discovery because your attorney never specifically requested them. But my appeal is already... Your direct appeal is nearly exhausted. But that's not the only pathway. Marcus returned his attention to the floor, his voice dropping even lower. There's a procedural mechanism most attorneys don't utilize because it's technically complex and time-consuming. A 2,255 motion based on ineffective assistance of counsel, not because your attorney was incompetent, but because specific evidence wasn't pursued that could have changed the outcome. Dante sat back down, his hands trembling slightly. Why are you telling me this? Marcus paused in his work, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because I've watched you for 3 weeks teaching yourself law with nothing but determination and library books. Because you're one of the few people in here who still believes knowledge matters, and because I spent 20 years teaching students how to think like lawyers, and I'm not ready to let that knowledge die with my reputation. The silence that followed carried weight, the beginning of a collaboration that would require both men to risk everything they had left. The education begins. Have you ever wondered what real education looks like when everything conventional has been stripped away? When there are no classrooms, no credentials, no safety nets, only knowledge fighting against time? This chapter reveals how transformation happens in the spaces between desperation and discipline. Stay with us to witness an alliance that defies every institutional barrier. Their first formal session occurred at 5:45 a.m., before the prison's rhythm fully awakened. Marcus arrived at the library with his cleaning cart, a legitimate reason for his presence. Dante was already there, surrounded by the same legal texts, but now with a yellow legal pad covered in questions. First lesson, Marcus said, beginning his cleaning routine around the perimeter. Stop thinking like a defendant. Start thinking like a lawyer. Defendants react, lawyers construct. He spoke while working, his voice a steady counterpoint to the swish of his mop. Your case isn't about justice or fairness. Those are emotional frameworks that cloud strategic thinking. Your case is about procedure, jurisdiction, and evidentiary standards. Master those 3 elements, and you create opportunities where none appeared to exist. Dante leaned forward, pen ready. Where do we start? With understanding why your attorney's appeal will fail. Not because the arguments are wrong, but because they're addressing the wrong legal question. Marcus paused his work, making eye contact. Your attorney argued sentencing disparity, that your sentence is disproportionate compared to similar cases. That argument fails because mandatory minimums eliminate judicial discretion. The judge had no choice. So we're trapped. We're trapped if we accept that framing. But law is architecture, Dante. When one door is locked, you don't stand there complaining about injustice. You find the window, the ventilation shaft, the foundation crack that everyone else overlooked. Marcus moved to the whiteboard used for prison education classes, erasing the previous day's GED math problems. He began drawing a flowchart. Investigation arrow arrest, arrow charging arrow, discovery arrow, trial arrow, sentencing, arrow appeal. Most people see this as a linear progression, but it's not. Each stage creates opportunities that remain dormant unless specifically activated. Your case has a vulnerability at the discovery stage, evidence that should have been disclosed but wasn't. The CI reports you mentioned. Exactly. But first we need to understand the legal foundation for accessing them now, after trial. That requires mastering Brady v. Maryland and its progeny. Marcus wrote the case name. The prosecution has a constitutional obligation to disclose evidence favorable to the defendant. If they didn't, and that evidence is material to guilt or punishment, it's grounds for a new trial. Dante's writing hand moved frantically. But how do we prove they had evidence they didn't turn over if we don't know what it says? That's the elegant part. We don't need to prove what the documents say. We need to prove they exist and were never disclosed. Then we file a motion compelling their production. Once we have them, we analyze them for Brady violations. For 2 hours, Marcus taught while cleaning, his curriculum invisible to any observer as simple maintenance work. He explained the difference between direct appeals and collateral attacks, between preserved and waived issues, between constitutional claims and statutory arguments. Each concept built upon the previous one, constructing a framework for understanding the law not as abstract justice but as a system with specific rules and exploitable gaps. The morning count interrupted them. As inmates filed past the library toward the cafeteria, Marcus offered final words. Tonight, read Strickland v. Washington. All of it, including the dissents. Understand what ineffective assistance means legally, not emotionally. We have a narrow window, and we can't afford to waste time on arguments that feel right but won't work. Dante gathered his materials, hesitating. Marcus, why are you really doing this? The janitor returned to his cart, considering the question. Because I failed someone once, a student who needed guidance I didn't provide because I'm serving time for losing perspective on what mattered. And because teaching you is the first thing I've done in 3 years that feels like redemption, rather than penance. As Dante left for count, Marcus continued cleaning, his mind already planning tomorrow's lesson. The work had begun. The price of knowledge. When everything is at stake, when one wrong move could destroy the last thread of hope, how do you maintain the discipline to build slowly toward an uncertain goal? This chapter explores the tension between urgency and patience, between desperation and strategy. Subscribe to discover how 2 men navigate the dangerous path between visibility and survival. The risks became apparent during week 2. Marcus had been too visible, spending too much time near Dante's table, their whispered conversations drawing attention. In a place where everyone watched everyone else, patterns created vulnerability. Officer Hendricks, a corrections officer with 15 years of institutional cynicism, stopped Marcus during his afternoon rounds. You spending a lot of time in that library, Webb. It's on my cleaning schedule, sir. Tuesday through Friday, 2 to 4 p.m. Noticed you talking to Morrison. That boy's got life coming. Lost cause. Hendricks's eyes narrowed. You're not running some kind of jailhouse lawyer scheme, are you? Because that requires authorization. Marcus kept his expression neutral, years of courtroom discipline serving him now. Just conversation, officer. Man gets lonely cleaning floors all day. Sometimes I comment on what people are reading passes the time. Uh-huh. Hendricks didn't believe him but lacked evidence for anything actionable. Keep it professional, and remember, janitors clean. They don't rehabilitate. Not your job to save anyone. The warning was clear. Marcus understood the unspoken rules. Prisoners were expected to serve their time, not challenge their convictions. Guards maintained order by ensuring everyone accepted their place. A janitor teaching legal strategy disrupted that equilibrium. That night, during recreation hour, Marcus found Dante on the basketball court's edge. We need to change our approach. Too much visibility. Dante's frustration was immediate. How are we supposed to work if we can't meet? We work smarter. I'll leave materials in specific locations during my rounds. You pick them up during your library time. We communicate through written notes, never verbal conversation where others can hear. Marcus's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to strategic thinking. This isn't just about your case anymore. If administration thinks I'm running an unauthorized legal practice, they'll transfer me to another facility. Everything we've built disappears. So we go underground. We acknowledge reality. Prison operates on visibility and control. Success requires becoming strategically invisible while accomplishing everything in plain sight. The new system emerged over the following days. Marcus would clean the library, discovering legal texts that he'd leave on specific shelves with yellow sticky notes marking relevant pages. Dante would arrive later, finding these texts, absorbing the marked sections. His questions would be written on notebook paper, tucked between books. Marcus's responses would appear the same way, their dialogue existing entirely in text, invisible to anyone not specifically looking. But the real challenge was psychological. Dante had never experienced education like this. Self-directed, high stakes, with no safety net. The law demanded precision, yet he was learning from fragments, building understanding from pieces scattered across their covert communication. I don't understand the difference between procedural default and waiver, Dante wrote in one note. They seem like the same thing. Marcus's response came the next day. They're similar, but procedurally distinct. Waiver is intentional relinquishment of a known right. Default is failure to raise an issue at the appropriate time. Different remedies attached to each waiver is nearly absolute. Default can be overcome with cause and prejudice. Master this distinction. Your entire case depends on it. 3 weeks into their underground education, Dante began changing. Other inmates noticed. His previous desperation had transformed into focused intensity. He stopped participating in the cell block's endless speculation and grievance. He woke earlier, wrote more, spoke less. Boy's got something going on, Marcus heard one inmate mutter. Too quiet, too focused. Nobody facing life acts like they got hope. That observation created its own danger. Hope was suspicious in a place designed to extinguish it. Marcus understood they were approaching a critical juncture. Either Dante's transformation would be dismissed as delusion, or it would attract the kind of attention that could destroy everything. The decision about when to file their motion was approaching, and with it, the moment when their work would become visible to everyone. Constructing the impossible. What does it take to build a legal argument strong enough to challenge a system designed to be impenetrable? This chapter takes you inside the painstaking construction of hope from fragments of law, procedure, and one young man's refusing to accept defeat. You're about to witness the architecture of the impossible. Stay with us. The motion itself would be Dante's masterpiece, but Marcus provided the blueprint. Their communication intensified as the legal framework took shape, each note building upon the previous, constructing an argument that had to be simultaneously aggressive and technically perfect. We're filing a 28 U.S.C. Section 2255 motion, Marcus wrote in one note. Grounds: ineffective assistance of counsel for failure to investigate and challenge the confidential informant's credibility and the evidentiary foundation for their testimony. Supporting argument: Brady violation for non-disclosure of CI debriefing materials that would have impeached the government's central witness. Dante's response showed his growing sophistication. But don't we need to show prejudice? That the outcome would have been different if the attorney had been effective? Exactly right. Which is why we're also requesting an evidentiary hearing. We argue that the withheld CI materials would have revealed the informant had no first-hand knowledge and was merely repeating second-hand information, inadmissible hearsay. Without the CI's testimony, the government's case collapses. No direct evidence connects you to drug distribution, only to being present in a vehicle. The challenge was making their argument specific enough to be compelling while acknowledging they hadn't yet seen the documents they needed. It required careful legal threading, establishing that the documents must exist based on standard investigative procedures, arguing their likely contents based on trial testimony inconsistencies, and demonstrating that any competent attorney would have requested them during discovery. Marcus spent his evenings in his cell, mentally drafting sections of the motion, committing them to memory so he could transcribe them the next day into notes for Dante. Each paragraph had to meet technical legal standards while remaining comprehensible to a judge who would be skeptical of any pro se prisoner motion. "The opening paragraph is critical," Marcus wrote. "It must immediately distinguish your motion from the thousands of desperate, legally insufficient motions judges see annually. Professional tone, precise legal citations, specific factual allegations. No emotional appeals, no claims of general injustice, pure legal argument." Dante was learning to write like a lawyer, which meant unlearning his natural voice. His early drafts contained passion and personality, understandable but counterproductive. Marcus's edits were surgical, removing emotion, tightening logic, ensuring every sentence advanced the legal argument without distraction. "Remove 'I am innocent' from the introduction," Marcus noted. "Legally irrelevant. Replace with, 'The conviction was obtained through the admission of testimony that violated Federal Rules of Evidence 602 and 802, and the failure to disclose impeachment evidence violated Brady v. Maryland.' Same meaning, but framed in legal terms the court must address." Their work drew them deeper into an unlikely partnership. Marcus found himself remembering why he'd loved teaching. The satisfaction of watching someone's mind expand, grasping concepts that seemed impossibly complex, until suddenly they crystallized into clarity. Dante discovered capabilities he'd never known he possessed: analytical thinking, systematic organization, the discipline to revise endlessly toward precision. But time was their enemy. Dante's direct appeal was approaching its final stage. Once that process concluded without success, a 1-year statute of limitations would begin running on his ability to file a 2255 motion. They had perhaps 4 months to complete what would normally take an experienced attorney a year with full resources. "We need to address the procedural default issue," Dante wrote. "The prosecution will argue I'm trying to raise claims I could have raised on direct appeal. Good instinct. That's our most vulnerable point. We address it head-on in Section 3. Argue that ineffective assistance claims are properly raised in 2255 motions, not direct appeals, because they require evidence outside the trial record. Cite Massaro v. United States. The court established that even claims that could theoretically be raised on direct appeal are properly brought in collateral proceedings when they involve ineffective assistance." The motion grew to 43 pages, each paragraph a careful balance of aggression and technical precision. They included 15 exhibits, trial transcripts highlighting inconsistencies in the CI's testimony, investigative timelines showing gaps in the documented chain of information, legal authorities establishing the disclosure obligations the prosecution had ignored. The final section was Marcus's innovation, a request for appointment of counsel. Most pro se motions were dismissed without ever receiving serious attention. But if they could persuade the court that Dante's motion raised substantial issues requiring expert investigation, the judge might appoint a federal public defender to take over, someone with resources to conduct the discovery they needed. "This is our Trojan horse," Marcus explained in a note. "We're not just asking the court to grant relief. We're asking them to acknowledge the issues are sufficiently complex that they require professional representation to fully develop. Once counsel is appointed, the motion gains credibility and investigative power." On a Tuesday morning in March, Dante submitted the motion to the court, 43 pages of legal argument, representing 4 months of underground education and collaboration. They had done everything they could. Now they waited. The waiting game. Anyone who's ever waited for a decision that could change everything knows this particular torture. The days stretching endlessly, hope and doubt battling for dominance. But this chapter isn't about passive waiting. It's about the internal discipline required to maintain focus when outcomes are uncertain and stakes are absolute. Join us as 2 men navigate the hardest part of any battle, the silence before the verdict. 63 days passed without response. In prison, time moved strangely, simultaneously glacial and accelerated, each day identical to the previous, yet somehow the weeks vanished, while individual hours crawled. Marcus maintained his routine with even greater discipline, understanding that consistency was survival. But he watched Dante carefully, noting the signs of psychological deterioration that threatened to undo everything they'd built. The young man was withdrawing, spending more time in his cell, less time in the library. During one of their carefully orchestrated encounters, Marcus cleaning near Dante's lunch table, Marcus spoke quietly while wiping down the adjacent surface. Waiting is its own discipline. The court has 90 days to respond, sometimes longer. Legal time operates differently than institutional time. What if they just deny it? All this work for nothing? Then we immediately file a notice of appeal to the circuit court. That's already drafted. But rejection isn't failure. It's information. It tells us which arguments need strengthening. Marcus moved to the next table, his voice carrying just enough to reach Dante. You're thinking about outcome when you should be thinking about process. We've already succeeded in one respect. You're no longer the same person who sat frozen in despair 4 months ago. That observation reached something in Dante. Marcus saw the young man's posture shift, the return of the focused intensity that had been slipping away. The breakthrough came on day 78. Officer Martinez approached Dante during recreation hour. Morrison, you got legal mail, court correspondence. The cell block's ambient noise shifted. Legal mail meant something was happening, breaking the monotony. Other inmates watched as Dante opened the envelope with trembling hands. Marcus, mopping the corridor outside the rec room, maintained his routine, but felt every muscle tensed. This was the moment everything hinged on. Dante read the single page, his expression unreadable. Then, breaking every protocol they'd established about discretion, he looked directly at Marcus through the doorway and nodded once. The order was brief. The court finds that petitioner's motion raises substantial constitutional claims requiring further development. Motion for appointment of counsel is granted. The Federal Public Defender's Office is directed to assume representation. Evidentiary hearing is scheduled for 60 days from this order to address the Brady and ineffective assistance claims. They'd won the first battle. The court hadn't dismissed the motion as frivolous. A federal public defender would now take over the case, bringing resources and credibility that no pro-SE prisoner could match. And most critically, there would be a hearing, an opportunity to present evidence, cross-examine witnesses, make their arguments to a judge who was clearly taking the issues seriously. But victory brought new complications. The appointment of counsel meant someone else would now control the case strategy. An attorney who hadn't been part of their months of work, who might not understand the nuances of the arguments they'd developed, who might dismiss Dante's legal education as amateurish and start over. That night, Marcus lay in his cell considering these new challenges. The motion had succeeded beyond his expectations, but it also marked the end of their direct collaboration. A professional attorney wouldn't welcome input from a janitor with a criminal record, regardless of his former credentials. He understood what was coming. Dante would need to present himself as a credible client, not as someone who'd been coached by another inmate. Their work together would need to become invisible, a foundation that supported the case without being acknowledged. 2 weeks later, Dante met his court-appointed attorney. Jennifer Reeves was a 10-year veteran of the Federal Public Defender's Office, experienced but overworked, initially skeptical of what she assumed would be another desperate long-shot case. Then she read the motion. "You wrote this?" she asked Dante during their first meeting in the prison's legal conference room. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him, reassessing. The motion was too sophisticated for most law school students, let alone a 22-year-old inmate with no legal training. But it was also exactly the kind of work that could win cases. Specific, aggressive, technically sound. The Brady argument is strong, very strong. If we can demonstrate the CI had no first-hand knowledge and the prosecution withheld that information, we have real grounds for a new trial. She made notes on her legal pad. But we need to understand exactly what happened during the original investigation. I'll need to interview you extensively about every detail. Dante nodded. Prepared Marcus had anticipated this moment, preparing him for exactly these questions. The key was presenting himself as intelligent, but not suspiciously sophisticated. Someone who'd taught himself through library research, not someone who'd been guided by a former law professor. Over the next 3 weeks, Reeves investigated the case with the resources Dante never had access to. She filed discovery motions compelling production of the CI debriefing reports. She interviewed the original defense attorney, documenting the specific discovery requests that were never made. She hired an investigator to trace the timeline of the confidential informant's involvement in the case. And slowly, the foundation Marcus and Dante had built began revealing its strength. The CI reports, once produced, showed exactly what they'd suspected. The informant had no direct knowledge of Dante's involvement in drug distribution. Instead, the CI had heard from another person, who heard from another person, a classic double hearsay chain that should never have been admitted at trial. "This is extraordinary," Reeves told Dante during their fourth meeting. "Your original attorney should have caught this. The prosecution absolutely should have disclosed it. If the judge excluded this testimony, the government's entire case collapses." Dante maintained careful composure, channeling everything Marcus had taught him about presenting confidence without arrogance. "What happens at the hearing? We present evidence. I'll call your original attorney, show the court exactly what discovery he failed to pursue. We'll call the prosecutor, force them to explain why these reports weren't disclosed. And if the judge agrees it's a Brady violation combined with ineffective assistance, you get a new trial, one where the jury never hears the inadmissible testimony that convicted you." Walking back to his cell after that meeting, Dante made brief eye contact with Marcus, who was cleaning the corridor. No words were exchanged, but the understanding passed between them. Their work had created something real, something that might actually accomplish the impossible. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks away. Everything they'd built was about to be tested in open court. The courtroom's return. There's a particular electricity when theory becomes reality, when months of careful planning must perform under absolute scrutiny. This chapter takes you into the federal courtroom where everything, freedom, justice, and two men's faith in the power of knowledge, hangs in the balance. This is where discipline meets destiny. The morning of the evidentiary hearing, Dante was transported from the prison in handcuffs and leg irons, sitting in the back of a marshal's van. He'd been in prison clothing for nearly 3 years, and the experience of moving through the free world, even chained, felt surreal. The federal courthouse was exactly as he remembered from his trial. Imposing marble, American flags, the weight of institutional authority embedded in every architectural detail. But this time felt different. This time he wasn't a confused defendant overwhelmed by a system he didn't understand. He was someone who'd studied that system, mastered its language, and learned to use its own rules as weapons. Jennifer Reeves met him in the holding cell adjacent to the courtroom. "Ready?" "Yes, ma'am." "Remember, you're here to observe, not participate. I'll handle the legal arguments. You've done the work that got us here. Now trust me to present it." She paused. "I've been practicing law for 10 years, and I've never seen a pro se motion as sophisticated as yours. Whatever education you gave yourself in that prison library, it was extraordinary." Dante nodded, hiding the truth. That his education hadn't come from books alone, but from a janitor who remembered what it meant to teach, with purpose. Judge Catherine Brennan entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. She was 63 years old, appointed to the federal bench by a president who believed in strict sentencing but also in procedural fairness. She'd read the motion, studied the issues, and her initial order granting counsel suggested she took the constitutional claims seriously. "Ms. Reeves, this is your hearing. Present your case." The next 3 hours were a masterclass in legal advocacy. Reeves systematically built the argument Marcus had designed, first establishing what evidence existed, then demonstrating it was never disclosed, then showing how its absence had prejudiced the defense. She called Dante's original trial attorney, who squirmed under questioning about his discovery practices. "Did you specifically request debriefing reports for confidential informant 147? "I requested all Brady material, as is standard practice. "But did you specifically request the CI's debriefing reports and 302s? "No. But the prosecution is required to turn over exculpatory material regardless of specific requests." "And when the prosecution didn't voluntarily disclose these materials, you didn't follow up?" I assumed if there was anything exculpatory, they would have provided it." Reeves's expression conveyed what she couldn't say aloud. That assumption was exactly the kind of passive representation that constituted ineffective assistance. She entered the CI's debriefing reports into evidence, walking the judge through their contents. "Your Honor, these reports make clear that CI 147 had no first-hand knowledge. The informant heard from someone named DJ, who heard from someone else, that Mr. Morrison was involved in drug distribution. That's double hearsay, inadmissible under Federal Rules of Evidence 802 unless specific exceptions apply, which they don't. The prosecutor, a 34-year-old assistant U.S. attorney named Michael Chen, fought back competently. The CI testified at trial. The defense had every opportunity to cross-examine about the basis of knowledge. But without the debriefing reports, Reeves countered, the defense had no way to know the testimony was based on double hearsay. The reports were Brady material, evidence that would have impeached the government's key witness. The prosecution's failure to disclose them violated Mr. Morrison's constitutional rights. Judge Brennan listened intently, asking pointed questions that revealed she deeply studied the issues. Her inquiries suggested someone wrestling with the tension between finality in criminal convictions and ensuring constitutional rights were actually protected. The hearing's climax came when Reeves called the original case agent, forcing him to admit that the CI's reliability was questionable, that the investigation had relied heavily on second-hand information, and that the entire case against Dante was circumstantial except for the CI's testimony. Without that testimony, Agent Morrison, what direct evidence connected Mr. Morrison to drug distribution? The agent hesitated. The drugs were found in a vehicle where he was a passenger. But testimony established that 4 other people had access to that vehicle, correct? Yes. And no fingerprints or DNA connected Mr. Morrison to the drugs specifically. Correct. So the CI's testimony was essential to the conviction. I would say it was significant, yes. Reeves rested her case, having done exactly what she'd promised. Demonstrated a constitutional violation significant enough to warrant a new trial. During the lunch recess, Dante sat in the holding cell reviewing what he'd witnessed. The arguments were his, developed over months of underground study with Marcus, but transformed by professional presentation into something more powerful than he'd imagined possible. Judge Brennan took 30 minutes after the afternoon session to render her decision from the bench. This court finds that the prosecution failed to disclose material impeachment evidence, constituting a Brady violation. Additionally, defense counsel's failure to specifically request and pursue the CI debriefing materials fell below an objective standard of reasonableness, constituting ineffective assistance under Strickland v. Washington. Most critically, this court finds prejudice. There is a reasonable probability that, had the jury known the CI's testimony was based on inadmissible hearsay, the result of the proceeding would have been different. Dante felt the words before fully processing them. Reasonable probability. Result would have been different. The legal standards for granting relief. Mr. Morrison's conviction is hereby vacated. The government has 90 days to decide whether to retry this case. Until then, Mr. Morrison is remanded to custody, but his sentence is stayed. If the government declines to retry, he will be immediately released. The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos. Reeves turned to Dante, her professional composure cracking into genuine emotion. We won. Do you understand? We won. But Dante's mind was elsewhere. With a janitor in a federal prison who'd believed that knowledge could still matter, that teaching still had power, that one person's refusal to accept institutional indifference could change another person's life. 3 days later, the government announced it would not retry the case. The evidence without the CI's testimony was insufficient. Dante Morrison would be released. The invisible victory. True triumph isn't always celebrated publicly. Sometimes the most profound victories happen in shadows, witnessed only by those who understand what was really at stake. This chapter explores the aftermath of legal victory and the quiet reckoning that comes when success arrives not with fanfare, but with the simple opening of a prison gate. Stay with us for the resolution that reveals what redemption really means. Dante's release came on a Thursday morning, 37 days after Judge Brennan's ruling. The processing took 3 hours, returning personal property, closing institutional accounts, the bureaucratic dismantling of his prisoner identity. Jennifer Reeves met him outside the prison gates, having volunteered to drive him to a halfway house where he'd begin rebuilding his life. But first, they had unfinished business. I need to know, she said once they were in her car. That motion you filed, the legal sophistication, the strategic choices, the way you built the argument you had help. Dante considered lying, protecting Marcus from potential institutional consequences. But Reeves's tone wasn't accusatory. It was respectful, recognizing collaboration rather than condemning it. "There's a janitor, Marcus Webb. He used to teach law at Georgetown before he made mistakes that brought him here. He saw me drowning and threw me a rope made of knowledge." Reeves nodded slowly. "I suspected something like that. No offense, but that motion was written by someone with decades of legal experience. Marcus Webb." She pulled out her phone, searching quickly. "Embezzlement, Georgetown Law School professor. Published extensively on criminal procedure and evidence law. Released in 2 years for good behavior. He never told me he was getting out soon. Maybe he didn't want that to influence your work? Or maybe he just wanted to teach again, regardless of what happened to him." Reeves pulled into traffic, navigating toward the city. "You should know. What you two accomplished together is being noticed. I've shared the motion with colleagues. People are talking about the legal reasoning, the way you leveraged procedural mechanisms most attorneys don't fully understand. That's Marcus's legacy as much as yours." But Dante's thoughts had already turned back to the man still inside those walls. Marcus had given him freedom but would remain imprisoned for 22 more months. The injustice of that reality, that his teacher would continue cleaning floors while he walked free, sat heavy in his chest. "Can I write to him?" "Not directly, prisoner-to-prisoner correspondence is prohibited, but—" Reeves smiled slightly. "I'm his attorney now, too. I'm filing a motion for early release based on his institutional record and the pro bono legal work he's been doing. Teaching other inmates, helping with legal research. The warden knows about it now. Your case made it impossible to ignore. Will it work? Hard to say. But federal judges appreciate rehabilitation that serves others. Marcus didn't just help you. He reminded everyone that education and expertise don't disappear because someone made mistakes. That has value." Inside the prison, Marcus learned of Dante's release from Officer Martinez, who mentioned it casually during morning rounds. "That kid Morrison got out, case overturned. Guess he wasn't as guilty as everyone thought." Marcus continued mopping, his expression neutral. But something shifted inside him. For 3 years he'd performed penance through invisible work, convinced his teaching career had ended with his conviction. But Dante's freedom represented something different. Proof that knowledge retained power even when its source was discredited. That teaching could happen anywhere if the commitment was genuine. That afternoon, the warden called him to the administrative office. "Webb, we need to discuss your activities in the law library." Marcus prepared for punishment, assuming his unauthorized teaching had finally drawn official consequences. Instead, Warden Patricia Simmons surprised him. "Attorney Reeves explained what you did for Morrison, taught him, guided him, helped him overturn a wrongful conviction. That's unusual." Simmons studied him, reassessing. "We have 32 inmates here serving mandatory minimums, many with potentially valid legal claims they lack the knowledge to pursue. Would you be interested in formalizing what you've been doing? Leading a legal education program, supervised and authorized?" Marcus felt the question's weight. Official authorization meant structure, oversight, accountability. It also meant legitimacy, a chance to teach openly rather than in shadows. "I would, yes, with appropriate limitations and supervision." "Good. We'll start small. Twice weekly sessions in the library. You teach legal research, procedural basics, how to identify potentially meritorious claims. Inmates still need professional attorneys for actual representation, but you can help them understand the system well enough to advocate for themselves intelligently." After leaving the warden's office, Marcus returned to his cell and wrote a letter he knew he couldn't send directly but trusted would somehow reach its destination. "Dante, you're free because you refused to accept helplessness, because you believed knowledge could be weaponized against injustice, and because you had the discipline to learn when learning felt impossible. Those qualities are yours, not mine. I simply provided a map. You walked the difficult terrain I taught for 20 years at Georgetown, and I helped hundreds of students become attorneys. But in all that time, I never witnessed a transformation as complete as yours. You taught yourself to think like a lawyer under conditions that would break most law students. That's not education. That's metamorphosis. I'm staying here 22 more months, and I've made peace with that. My debt is being paid not through suffering, but through service. The warden has authorized me to teach openly now, thanks to the attention your case brought. So your victory ripples outward, creating opportunities for others. Don't visit. Don't write. Don't compromise your new freedom by maintaining connections to this place. But do this. When you encounter someone who's drowning, someone who's given up hope because they don't understand the systems that control their life, throw them a rope made of knowledge. Teach them that intelligence and discipline can overcome almost anything. That's how we redeem the time we've lost. Marcus. The letter found its way to Dante through Jennifer Reeves, who read it first and understood what both men had accomplished. A collaboration that transcended the institutional barriers designed to prevent exactly this kind of human connection. Dante read it in his halfway house room, sitting on a narrow bed not much different from his prison bunk, and wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of what gift he'd received. Not just freedom, but the tools to understand power, challenge injustice, and help others do the same. He would honor that gift by living deliberately, by refusing to waste the second chance Marcus had helped him create. Ripples outward. Have you ever wondered what happens when one act of courageous teaching sets off a chain reaction? When one person's refusal to accept defeat inspires others to believe in transformation? This chapter reveals how change propagates through systems, how hope becomes contagious, and how two men's alliance created consequences neither could have anticipated. Keep reading to see how knowledge becomes legacy. 6 months after Dante's release, Marcus's prison education program had grown from twice-weekly library sessions to a comprehensive legal literacy curriculum serving 43 inmates. The warden's initial skepticism had transformed into institutional support, as successful case outcomes began accumulating. Marcus taught with renewed purpose, understanding now that his Georgetown career hadn't ended, it had simply relocated. His students were desperate men facing decades behind bars, but they were also motivated in ways privileged law students rarely demonstrated. When education meant the difference between life imprisonment and freedom, attention was absolute. His teaching methodology evolved for this environment. Traditional law school emphasized theoretical analysis and appellate argument. Marcus's prison curriculum focused on procedural literacy, understanding how the criminal justice system actually functioned, identifying the specific moments where legal errors occurred, recognizing what claims had genuine merit versus desperate speculation. Most of you will never go to trial again, he told his students during one session. Your fight now is procedural, identifying constitutional violations that occurred during your original cases. This isn't about your innocence, it's about whether the government followed its own rules in convicting you. One student, Robert Chen, had been serving 18 years for drug trafficking. During his trial, evidence had been admitted from a search that Chen's original attorney never challenged. Despite questionable probable cause, Marcus taught him the Fourth Amendment jurisprudence necessary to identify the violation, then guided him through filing a suppression motion. The federal public defender who took over Chen's case was astounded by the motion's quality. This is professional-level work. The case was still pending, but the judge had ordered an evidentiary hearing. Exactly the same breakthrough Dante had achieved, Chen's conviction might be vacated, a family might be reunited, all because a janitor refused to believe his teaching days had ended. But the program's success created unexpected complications. As word spread through the federal prison system, Marcus began receiving letters from inmates in other facilities seeking guidance. The requests were overwhelming, hundreds of desperate people begging for help that one man couldn't possibly provide. Jennifer Reeves proposed a solution. What if we create a training program? You teach inmates in multiple facilities to become peer legal educators, multiplying your impact. It wouldn't be authorized practice of law, just education about how the system works. The proposal was ambitious, requiring coordination across the Bureau of Prisons, approval from multiple wardens, and development of a standardized curriculum. But it was also exactly what Marcus had been unconsciously building toward. A systematic approach to empowering imprisoned people with legal knowledge. Meanwhile, Dante's life outside prison was developing in unexpected directions. Working at a nonprofit legal aid organization, he'd become an advocate for criminal justice reform, using his own story to highlight how mandatory minimums created injustice. His natural intelligence, now trained through Marcus's rigorous education, made him an effective spokesman. He testified before a congressional committee considering sentencing reform. I'm standing here not because I was innocent, but because I learned to navigate a system that's designed to be incomprehensible to people without legal training. Most people in prison never get that chance. They serve decades not because they're guilty, but because they don't understand that conviction and evidence are different questions, that procedure matters as much as facts. His testimony was covered by national media journalists asked about his education, how a high school dropout learned to write sophisticated legal motions. Dante carefully credited legal resources available in prison without naming Marcus, understanding that protecting his teacher meant maintaining strategic ambiguity. But one journalist was persistent, tracking down Jennifer Reeves, piecing together the story of the janitor who'd taught a young man facing life imprisonment how to think like a lawyer. The article, published in The Atlantic, was titled, "The Prison Professor: How an Invisible Janitor Became One Man's Salvation." Marcus learned about the article from Warden Simmons, who called him to her office with an unreadable expression. He prepared for consequences, assuming the publicity would be treated as problematic. Instead, she slid the magazine across her desk. "Read." The article portrayed Marcus as someone who'd lost everything but retained the one thing that mattered: commitment to education as transformation. It detailed Dante's case, the underground teaching, the sophisticated legal strategy that emerged from their collaboration. It ended with statistics about how many inmates never receive adequate legal representation, and how legal education programs might address that gap. "You're famous now," Simmons said, "which creates problems for me. Either I shut down your program because it's attracting too much attention, or I expand it and embrace the publicity. What do you think I should do?" Marcus considered carefully. "The work is valuable regardless of attention. These men are learning skills that serve them whether they win their cases or not. They're learning that knowledge is power, that understanding systems is the first step toward navigating them." That sounds like something a professor would say. Because it's true, regardless of who says it. Simmons made her decision that afternoon, issuing a statement that the Bureau of Prisons was exploring legal education programs as part of rehabilitation efforts. Marcus's work became a pilot program, with evaluations scheduled to determine if the model could expand to other facilities. The publicity brought unexpected visitors. Law professors from Georgetown, Marcus's former colleagues, requested permission to observe his teaching. They arrived skeptical. Prison was not an academic environment, but left impressed by the curriculum's sophistication and their former colleagues' adaptation to impossible circumstances. "You're doing better work here than you ever did in our classrooms," one colleague admitted. "These students actually need what you're teaching. It's not theoretical, it's survival." That observation contained truth Marcus had been circling around for months. His Georgetown career had been prestigious but abstract. He'd taught students who would become comfortable lawyers serving comfortable clients. Here, he was teaching men who faced devastating sentences, who needed knowledge not for professional advancement, but for basic justice. The redemption wasn't in the publicity or the program's expansion. It was in the recognition that his greatest teaching might happen in the place where he'd lost everything else 8 months into his program. Marcus received word that his motion for early release had been approved. He would serve 15 months instead of 22, time credited for his educational work and institutional behavior. The news should have felt like liberation. Instead, Marcus felt torn. The program was working. Students were learning. Cases were being won. Walking away felt like abandoning the work before it was complete. He shared this concern with Jennifer Reeves during her next visit. "I'm leaving before the foundation is solid. What happens to the program after I'm gone? You've trained 12 peer educators who can continue the work, and you'll be able to do more outside than inside consult for legal aid organizations, develop curriculum, train attorneys on how to identify wrongful convictions. Your release isn't an ending, it's an expansion." On his last day at the prison, Marcus taught his final class 47 inmates attended, cramming into the library's capacity. He didn't deliver a farewell speech. He simply taught the day's lesson, about recognizing Brady violations, then packed his materials and left the same way he'd arrived. Quietly, without fanfare, the work speaking louder than any words. As he walked toward the prison gates for the last time, Officer Martinez stopped him. "Webb, that kid Morrison, the others you helped. That matters. Just thought you should know." Marcus nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without pride or false humility. It mattered because the work mattered, because knowledge had power, because teaching was never just about information. It was about showing someone their own capacity for transformation. He stepped through the gates into March sunshine, free after 51 months, returning to a world that had moved on without him but carrying knowledge about human potential that most people never gained. His real work was just beginning. The Architecture of Hope. This final chapter isn't an ending. It's a beginning, because the most powerful stories are the ones that teach us how to write our own. Join us as we discover what happens when two men's collaboration becomes a blueprint for transformation that extends far beyond their individual lives. Subscribe for the conclusion that reveals why some lessons can only be learned in the most unexpected places. 18 months after his release, Marcus stood before a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee, testifying about criminal justice reform. The hearing room was formal, intimidating, designed to emphasize institutional power. But Marcus had learned in prison that real authority came from knowledge, not architecture. Senator, the question isn't whether people in prison can be rehabilitated. The question is whether we create conditions that make rehabilitation possible. Legal education programs don't just help individuals challenge wrongful convictions. They teach systematic thinking, research skills, and procedural literacy that serve people regardless of their legal outcomes. He presented data from his prison program. 47 participants, 12 successful case outcomes resulting in sentence reductions or vacated convictions, and, most importantly, 0 disciplinary incidents among participants during their enrollment. Men who were learning had purpose. Purpose reduced desperation. Reduced desperation made prisons safer for everyone. Senator Williams, a former prosecutor skeptical of criminal justice reform, asked pointed questions. Mr. Webb, aren't you essentially teaching inmates to be better at gaming the system? To file frivolous motions that waste judicial resources? Marcus had anticipated this critique. I teach exactly the opposite. I teach people to distinguish between legitimate legal issues and desperate speculation. I teach them that courts respond to specific, well-researched arguments, not emotional appeals. And I teach them that understanding why their conviction was lawful is as valuable as finding technical errors. How is accepting guilt valuable? Because it's honest. Some of my students conclude they were convicted fairly under applicable law. That acceptance allows them to focus on rehabilitation rather than endless litigation. But others discover genuine constitutional violations that resulted in wrongful convictions. Legal education gives them tools to tell the difference. Dante Morrison testified immediately after Marcus, representing the National Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers. His transformation was visible. The desperate young man Marcus had first encountered in Cell Block D had become an articulate advocate for systemic reform. I wouldn't be standing here if I hadn't learned to navigate a legal system that's designed to be incomprehensible to ordinary people, Dante told the committee. Marcus Webb didn't just teach me law. He taught me that intelligence and discipline could overcome institutional barriers. That education is itself a form of freedom, regardless of physical circumstances. The hearing resulted in bipartisan support for a pilot program funding legal education initiatives in 20 federal prisons. Marcus was appointed to the Oversight Committee, working with Bureau of Prisons administrators to develop standardized curriculum and training protocols. But his most important work happened quietly, outside institutional spotlight. He consulted with legal aid organizations, teaching attorneys how to identify cases where ineffective assistance and constitutional violations might have resulted in wrongful convictions. He trained law students on procedural mechanisms most lawyers never mastered. He built systems that multiplied his individual impact. Jennifer Reeves recruited him to teach at her office, training new public defenders on evidence law and Brady obligations. You understand the consequences of legal errors in ways most attorneys never will. You've seen how procedural failures destroy actual lives. The collaboration between Marcus, Dante, and Jennifer expanded into a non-profit organization, the Legal Literacy Project. Its mission was simple: provide legal education resources to imprisoned people, not to replace attorneys, but to empower individuals to become effective self-advocates. They developed curriculum modules on constitutional rights, procedural timelines, evidence law, and effective legal research. The materials were designed for people with no legal background, but high motivation. They created a network of volunteer attorneys willing to review inmate-drafted motions, providing feedback without taking over representation. 2 years after the Senate hearing, the project had expanded to 47 prisons across 12 states. Thousands of inmates had received legal education. Hundreds had successfully challenged their convictions or obtained sentence reductions. But the statistics that mattered most were harder to quantify. How many people had regained hope, learned to think systematically, discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. On a Tuesday afternoon, Marcus received an email from Robert Chen, the student who'd challenged his search and seizure. "Professor Webb, I'm out. 3 weeks now. Judge granted my suppression motion. Conviction vacated. Government declined to retry. I have a job doing outreach for at-risk youth, telling them my story. Everything you taught me about thinking before reacting, about understanding systems rather than just fighting them, I'm passing that along. The education doesn't stop. Thank you." Marcus read the message twice, feeling the weight of accumulated gratitude from dozens of similar emails, letters, phone calls. Men and women who'd been drowning, who'd found ropes made of knowledge, who'd climbed toward freedom through discipline and learning. He thought about his Georgetown career, the comfortable office, the prestigious publications, the professional respect he'd enjoyed before his mistakes had destroyed it all. That life seemed distant now, belonging to someone else. This life, teaching people who desperately needed education, working with individuals whose entire futures hung on understanding procedural nuances, building systems that transform desperation into systematic advocacy. This was the career he should have always pursued. On the 3rd anniversary of Dante's release, they organized a small celebration. Jennifer brought her family. Marcus invited former students who'd been released. 23 people gathered in a community center, sharing food and stories, their presence representing collective testimony to transformation's possibility. Dante stood to offer a toast. 3 years ago, I was sitting in a cell facing life imprisonment, convinced my future had been decided. Then a janitor started leaving me notes, teaching me that knowledge was power, that understanding systems was the first step toward freedom. Marcus didn't save me. He taught me to save myself. That's the greatest gift anyone can receive. Marcus responded quietly, uncomfortable with the tension, but recognizing the moment's significance. I spent 20 years teaching law to students who mostly wanted credentials and comfortable careers. Then I lost everything and ended up in prison, mopping floors, believing my teaching days had ended. But Dante showed me that teaching isn't about institutions or credentials. It's about recognizing someone's potential and refusing to let it be wasted. Everything we've built since then is just multiplication of that simple principle. Everyone deserves access to knowledge, especially people whose freedom depends on it. The celebration continued into evening, stories accumulating like evidence of what's possible when education meets desperation, when discipline encounters genuine need, when 2 people refuse to accept that prison walls can contain knowledge or limit human potential. Late that night, Marcus returned to his apartment, modest but his own, and sat at his desk, looking at the stack of letters requesting help, the curriculum modules needing revision, the strategic plans for expanding the legal literacy project. The work was endless, as all meaningful work was, but it was also exactly where he belonged. Teaching people who needed knowledge not for advancement but for survival, building systems that gave desperate people tools to navigate institutions designed to overwhelm them, proving daily that education remained the most powerful weapon against injustice. His prison sentence had ended. His real sentence, the one he'd imposed on himself, to use his knowledge in service of people who needed it most, would continue until he decided it was complete. And perhaps, he thought, that was exactly what redemption looked like. Not forgiveness for past mistakes, but commitment to work that transformed those mistakes into something valuable, something that served others, something that proved even our greatest failures could become foundations for unexpected purpose. He opened his laptop and began drafting tomorrow's curriculum module. The work continuing, one lesson at a time, one student at a time, building an architecture of hope from the invisible materials of knowledge, discipline, and the stubborn refusal to accept that any person was beyond transformation. The janitor had become a teacher again, but more importantly, he'd learned that teaching had never stopped. It had simply found its truest purpose in the last place anyone expected to look. Dear reader, Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most powerful demonstrations of human resilience and the transformative power of knowledge you'll encounter. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something about the unexpected places where wisdom and courage emerge, please subscribe to ensure you never miss stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal the extraordinary potential within ordinary moments. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that circumstances don't define capability, that education transcends institutions, and that one person's refusal to give up on another can change everything. The most powerful transformations happen not in spotlight, but in the patient, invisible work of people who believe in human potential even when society has decided someone is beyond redemption. That's the lesson Marcus and Dante teach us. Knowledge is freedom, discipline is power, and teaching is the most profound form of hope we can offer another human being. Subscribe now and become part of a community that believes in transformation, celebrates resilience, and understands that the greatest stories are the ones that teach us how to write our own.